Hello Internet, welcome back to Tromsø Twilight, the channel where I, Vincent, talk to you, the cosmos, about books, movies, music I enjoy, find interesting, or a combination of the two. If you're interested in book discussions, I'm soon going to do a video talking about the books that I'm planning to read over the summer and maybe getting some advice on which ones to prioritize. But today I want to talk about this novel, Dreamland, which I read recently. I am quite ambivalent about the book. There's some things that I find a little troubling about it, and there are also some things that I think are super fascinating. I'm not going to give major spoilers, but I'll say a little bit about the concept of the book at the start. I'll talk about my misgivings, and then I'll talk about the aspects of the book that I think are really very interesting. This novel, Dreamland, it's set in Margate, which is a seaside town in the estuary area of the UK outside of London. It's an area that was at one time very run down. And it's been kind of gentrified. So this novel takes place in the near future, and the central character, who's named Chance, moves from London to Margate because the government are giving people who need social housing money if they move out of the city, move out to places like Margate. And the writer, Rosa Rankin-Gee, mentions at the back of the book that this is actually a real strategy. The government of the United Kingdom move people who are less affluent and who are in need of social support to the margins of the city and then out of the city. The girl who is the central character in the book, Chance, when she's a child, she makes a close friend called Davy. And she has an older brother that she and Davy kind of look up to, who's named JD. JD, as a teenager, becomes a drug dealer, and he gets his mother and his sister a kind of flat where they can all live together in an apartment block, which you see on the front of the book. And this is next to a rundown theme park called Dreamland, hence the name of the book. And this is kind of where the story of the book begins. Now, the book follows Chance kind of through her childhood and her teenage years. And as a teenager, she meets a girl of her own age called Frankie, who comes from the city, comes from London, but you don't know much more about her except that Chance can really tell that Frankie comes from a different socioeconomic background. She seems to have educated parents, she seems to have money, but she's a little bit vague about who she is. And they have quite a sweet romantic relationship that becomes kind of complicated in the context of the book. All right, so to get my misgivings out of the way, this book is about the working class and the underclass of the United Kingdom. Now, I didn't grow up in a council house, but my mother did. My grandparents lived in a council house my entire childhood, and they looked after me a lot. So I, in my childhood and my teenage years, am not like far away from the demographic, the community that this book is written about. You know, granted, it's written somewhat into the future, and it's at a time when the country is in decline, but as I was reading it, I was kind of torn because Chance and Davy and JD are really well drawn characters. They're really sympathetic, and you get the definite sense that Rosa Rankin-Gee really loves Chance, the central character, and has maybe drawn on her own sense of humor and her kind of emotional life to draw the character. But I kind of have a bit of a chip on my shoulder about the fact that British novels of the working class and the so-called underclass tend to always be about violence, drug abuse, dysfunctional families, incest, and such like. And all the characters of this book kind of fall into that kind of lifestyle, which isn't necessarily the most representative life experience of somebody from this demographic, but it's how the middle classes of the United Kingdom see the economic issues of the country. They see them in these terms. Even though a lot of it is projection, like the middle classes and the educated classes and the affluent people of the United Kingdom use a lot of drugs and as you know, dysfunctional in their family dynamics as anybody, I would say. And there's lots of abuse that goes unreported and unaddressed, but they kind of project all this onto the working class. And I was reading this book, and at first I thought maybe this was written more from experience, but as it was going on and there were more and more of these kind of cliches, I started to think okay, I think maybe Rosa Rankin-Gee maybe didn't really come from this type of background, and where I grew up nobody has a double barrel name, and the mother of Chance comes from Surrey, which is an affluent area of the United Kingdom. So I kept kind of, I know this is maybe my own hang-ups, but I kept thinking it reads like somebody who kind of comes from a comfortable background, imagining what it would be like to live in a rough, difficult, stressful environment. And in that sense, it's a little bit patronizing. That said, there are some things this book does really well in a way that makes it very endearing. Although the context and the events of the lives of the characters are somewhat coloured by this kind of vision of the underclass that you always encounter in English literary fiction. At the same time, the relationships are very warm and moving and convincing. And as I mentioned about the sense of humour earlier, the dialogue is very witty, it's very endearing, and there are some deeply, deeply moving, painful, emotional passages in the book as well. Also, its political critique is actually brilliant, despite what I've said up until now. Rosa Rankin-Gee, she lives in Margate. She moved out there with her parents, I think. I discovered after I read the book that she's the daughter of Maggie Gee, the novelist. And she has a real kind of sense of the geography and the architecture of the place. And she imagines it as the site of what Aimé Césaire called the Imperial Boomerang. This is the idea that whatever a country, a nation, a culture does within its colonies, within its foreign policy, it will eventually turn those authoritarian techniques back upon its own population. Rosa Rankin-Gee imagines the people of a marginalised community within the UK being subject to all the kind of authoritarian measures that refugees are subject to within Europe now. And additionally, she imagines essentially a political force coming in from the capital and flooding the area with alcohol and cheap drugs to kind of pacify the population, and then also employing them to create measures that will ultimately work against them. And these are also things that the United Kingdom has done in its colonies. Not least, for example, I think it's like referencing the Opium Wars, where the British Empire flooded China with opium. Also within this, she's presenting threads of fascism that maybe you don't know so much about if you haven't studied political theory, like Malthusianism, the idea that there's only a certain amount of resources, so we should apply population control, and maybe in the form of starvation or deprivation, but also a kind of ecological fascism that reminds me of Pentti Linkola, the Finnish philosopher who was a year-round fisherman who advocated for the end of immigration and for basically rolling back technology and a kind of strict authoritarian ecological regime to try to protect the world from humans, or at least reverse the damage humans were doing to the world. It's sometimes called deep ecology or eco-fascism. So all these things are kind of worked into the book, and she's imagining how these ideas, which have been relatively niche, can seep into mainstream political culture the more we're confronted with the consequences of environmental changes. Now, this is all pretty fascinating because, I mean, the novel came out in 2021. I guess she was writing it in the period before that. And in the period subsequent, the UK is clearly slipping into fascism. Nigel Farage, who was a kind of minor figure in British politics, actually looks like a credible political force now, and there are race riots taking place. So the book, in some ways, is quite prophetic of the current situation, and I think that Rosa Rankin-Gee's understanding of politics and political forces and political theory is threaded into the book in such an intelligent way, because what ends up happening is that through these characters like Chance and Davy, you see fascism from the perspective of the person who is subjected to it without having the full context. I think it's really, really well achieved. So, despite my irritation, which I often have with kind of affluent, educated, middle class writers writing about the type of community that Rosa Rankin-Gee is trying to write about in this book, I do actually think that it's a very moving, effective, and thought provoking novel. The last thing to say is that when I discovered after I finished the novel that Rosa Rankin-Gee was Maggie G's daughter, it kind of made sense, because Maggie G had a novel from, I guess, the early 2000s called The Ice People, which was a sort of reverse global warming idea where the people of Europe kind of became refugees to the African continent. And she also wrote a book called The Flood, which was a lot about the effects of climate change. So it's interesting how Rosa Rankin-Gee has kind of like continued that project in a way, but with a very different voice, and in some ways a little more emotional in tone than Maggie G, who was a touch more satirical in her writing. So if you've read the book, let me know what you think of it. If you haven't read the book, you're welcome to comment and have a chat with me in the comments as usual. If you like the video, please click like on it. It really helps support the channel. And I'll be back soon with a new video, and perhaps I'll see you there.